My name is Patrick McGarry, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to House Playfair and McGarry's Understanding Grief virtual seminar. This presentation will feature grief education, advice, and coping strategies with a special emphasis on the complexities of grieving during COVID-19. As a locally owned and operated funeral, cremation, and celebration of life service provider with a long-term commitment to our community, it is our honor to provide guidance and support. As many of you know, House Playfair McGarry has a long history of providing complimentary and informative seminars. In the past, we have addressed both in person and virtually service clubs, lunch and learn groups, financial advisors, church groups, seniors associations, retired professionals, and the list goes on. We consider it our privilege to support our community in any way we can. If we can be of service to you or your group with a presentation, we would be honored. In reviewing the list of registered attendees, I note a number of individuals joining us that have recently experienced a loss. Thank you for taking the time to attend. It's important for you to know that you are not alone, and I hope this presentation provides you the strength to remember that in the difficult days ahead. I also noted a number who attended our previous virtual seminar titled Being Prepared Made Simple on the topic of estate preparation and funeral pre-planning. Thank you for joining us again. For anyone that missed that presentation, please know that a recording is available, as well as the My Biography Journal, to anyone that wishes. Simply email us or let us know in the post-presentation survey. Before I introduce our expert presenter, I do have a few housekeeping items to inform you of. First, I encourage you to be in a comfortable and quiet space. You will be receiving a lot of helpful information during this presentation, and we want to make sure you are able to absorb as much as possible. Due to the large attendance, the amount of content, and the sensitive topic, we won't be taking live questions during the presentation. Your microphones have been automatically muted and cameras turned off to limit background noise and to ensure you can focus on the presenter. For optimal viewing of this live presentation, please turn off your gallery view by switching it to the standard or side-by-side speaker view on your computer. For those joining us by a mobile device, you can drag my video to whatever part of your screen you want it, or rotate your device and the video will move automatically. Finally, please remember that we will be providing all attendees with a grief resource package following the presentation. I will provide more information on this later. So without any further delay, it's my honor and privilege to now introduce our expert presenter, Suzanne Duke. Suzanne Duke is a registered psychotherapist in private practice in Ottawa. She is regularly consultant as an expert in the areas of grief, bereavement, and trauma resolution. In addition to providing psychotherapy for individuals, couples, and groups, Suzanne also provides mediation, crisis intervention, and critical incident stress debriefing services for organizations. I will be now transferring over to Suzanne.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Suzanne, and as Patrick mentioned, I'm a registered psychotherapist here in Ottawa. Before I get started with my presentation, I thought it might be helpful to explain what a psychotherapist does for those of you who may not be clear. I know that I certainly wasn't before I got into the profession. In a nutshell, a psychotherapist is a mental health professional who treats psychological concerns through talk therapy. These could be problems of daily living, of which grief would certainly fall into that category, or more serious mental health considerations. I also thought you might like to know why I chose to specialize in the field of grief, trauma, and trauma resolution. As it happens, I became interested in these areas when I did my master's placement for the Beth Donovan Hospice in Kemptville. And I really wish that I could see all of you so that I could get sort of a show of hands to know that who might be here from Kemptville tonight, because I know certainly the Beth Donovan Hospice is well known in the area. It's a wonderful, wonderful resource for the community, and I learned so much while I was there. Truly, I gained primarily in my work with the Beth Donovan Hospice a deeper understanding of a number of things. First and foremost, death and dying. Secondly, grief and mourning. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the power of community in terms of helping people to cope. And that's really what this presentation is designed to do. I ended up working in hospice for almost 3 years, which included training hospice volunteers, doing community outreach like this tonight, and certainly education, running spousal and suicide loss groups, and providing a lot of grief counseling to the bereaved. It's also through hospice that I met Patrick McGarry, and I wanted to thank him and the staff at Hulse Playfair McGarry for hosting me in delivering what I hope will be a helpful presentation to all of you tonight. Patrick is one of the most caring people I have met in funeral service, and it's clear that he cares deeply about the families his company serves, hence this presentation. So a big thank you to Patrick. I'd also like to take a moment before I begin to say that if you or someone you care about has endured a loss, and this is what is bringing you to attend the seminar tonight, please know that you have my heartfelt condolences, and I'm so glad that you're here. So let's spend some time together. Grief is generally a heavy topic. And one of the things that I wanted to say is I understand that unfortunately the Eventbrite link that we've sent out reminding you of this event recommended that you get excited about it. And I wanted to let you know that obviously we had no idea that sort of that would be said. It doesn't necessarily set the right tone, because although you might have been looking forward to tonight or to being informed about how to understand grief, we certainly didn't want to suggest that it was something to get excited about. In any case, as I was saying, that grief can be heavy, and as such, it might be a good idea to settle some of our energy before we begin, because we may be coming to the presentation anxious or activated, and certainly it could be a good idea just to kind of bring things down a little bit. For me too, as a presenter, it's one of the first times I've done a live Zoom seminar, so thank you for bearing with me. In any case, I thought I'd lead you in a short breathwork exercise so that you can hopefully let go of any tension that you might be carrying. The truth of the matter is that we often forget how to breathe fully when we're anxious or we're upset. So I'm going to show you how to breathe in a way that can calm your nervous system into a more settled rhythm. And hopefully doing so will set the tone for this presentation. So as Patrick suggested earlier, just going to suggest that you sit comfortably in your chair. You can keep your eyes open or closed and just tune in to the sound of my voice. So what we're going to do is essentially we're going to take 5 deep breaths together. And what I'd like you to do is to breathe in through your nostrils as if you're smelling a delicious scent. So that might be lilacs at this time of the year, could be, I don't know, cinnamon, it could be clean sheets, fresh air, whatever is a wonderful smell to you. And then on the exhale, when you breathe out, I want you to imagine that you're blowing out a candle. Okay, so breathing in a delicious scent through your nostrils and blowing out the candle on the exhale. And if you can, hold your exhale for a count of 4. Okay, so let's do that together then. So we'll breathe in through our nostrils and breathe out as if you're blowing out a candle. Breathe in again and exhale. Breathe in and exhale, and let your shoulders drop. Good. Breathe in and exhale for a count of 4 and 4. And last deep breath in, fill your lungs, let them hit the side of your rib cage. And a deep breath out. Very good. So when you're ready, just come back to me and just notice if you've let any tension go. I know I have. So besides calming you, I have other plans for you tonight in terms of what I would like to teach you. My primary hope is that you walk away from this presentation feeling more informed about grief responses, whether they be yours or someone else's, and how to move through these in a compassionate way. To that end, we're going to talk about grief. What is it? What does it mean to be in grief or grieving? Some of the myriad of feelings we might experience while we're in grief, and certainly these will run the gamut. Different symptoms of grief, whether they be behavioral, physical, or psychological. Types or degrees of grief, if you will, from what we would think of as natural sadness or sorrow to more complex or complicated reactions. We'll also, in a very timely way, talk about grieving during a pandemic and sort of the unique factors that doing so has brought into our realities. As well, we'll have a brief discussion of theoretical thinking about grief. And we will devote some time to a consideration of coping strategies. How do we move through such pain? Of course, Patrick and I want to leave you as well with some information and resources that you can access after this presentation if needed. So as we move into the presentation now, I really thought that this first image was particularly relevant because I think most of us can relate to the roller coaster of emotion we feel when we're processing a loss. I also think that grief is sometimes like a wild ride and one that we find terrifying and wish we could just get the heck off of it. Unfortunately, as we know, grief and loss are inevitable. So this is one of those difficult life circumstances that we need to learn how to ride through. What is grief? I've heard a lot of analogies around it, some of which I'll share with you as we move through the presentation. But one of the most poignant that I've come across in my almost decade as a grief counselor and psychotherapist came to me while I was a student on placement in hospice. And the statement that you see before you was given to me by the mother of a dearly loved 18-year-old girl, her daughter, who had died suddenly. And what she said was that grief is like wandering in a foreign country with no map, no idea of where you're going, no timeline to get there. She told me that when she was in this strange land of grief, that she felt lost and lost most of the time. Think about that. And doesn't that ring true? It's still with me to this day. So let's remember that grieving mother's statement about feeling lost and lost, because I think it brings up a key point in that the way to understand grief is that we attach. We are human beings and we attach from our hearts, from a place of love. So whatever we attach to, whether it be a person, a place, a thing, an animal, an idea, at some point we may lose. And loss is inevitable, and therefore relatedly, so is grief. When we lose a person that we are attached to, we move into a process. And this process is called grief or grieving. I feel it's really important to mention that grief is an internal process. It's something that we do privately. It's inside us, whereas mourning is a social expression of grief. It's what we do with other people. What's critical to know is that we need both. They're two sides of the same coin. In other words, we need to do that private grief work, and we also need to mourn. We need to share our grief with other people in order to fully move through our grieving and hopefully to heal. As everyone on this call likely knows, the process of grieving may be overwhelming, bewildering, isolating, and painful, and it may also precipitate a crisis of meaning. What do I mean by that? A crisis of meaning is when we wonder, who am I now that the person I love has died? Who am I without my husband, my wife, my sibling, my friend, my coworker, my boss, my family member, my mentor? The list goes on. What do I do now? What's my purpose? Where is my place in the world? These and so many questions can arise in the aftermath of a loss. So what tends to happen after a significant loss is that we have adaptive parts of ourselves that surface to help us cope. And these first responses typically, but not always, include shock, an accompanying numbness, that feeling we have of sort of being on autopilot or robotic, if you will. Things are almost surreal. We may also experience disbelief. How could this have happened? And correspondingly, denial. I can't believe this has happened. One of the reasons these protective responses occur is that behind them, some really big, distressing feelings are brewing in response to the loss. This is how our mind copes. Otherwise, our system would short circuit. It would crash because this is too overwhelming to process all at once. Even when a death is expected, it can still come as a shock. And so I bring to you the image of a tidal wave, because the reality and the meaning of a loss can really rip through us like a giant wave once we can feel. And this is often followed by ripples of emotion and possibly other tidal waves of feeling, whether they be sadness, anger, regret, etc., as we process what has happened. What this means is that there will be an initial recognition of what has been lost, and then gradually the full impact of the loss will make itself known over time. Everyone, of course, is not the same, but this feeling of waves of emotion running through us is typically reported in grief. So, some common feelings in grief, and as this slide suggests, these feelings can really run the gamut. You'll note as well here that I've shown a picture of a child, and I do think it is worth mentioning that children and adolescents grieve very differently from adults. But unfortunately, that is a whole other presentation, which perhaps one day I'll be in a position to give. Negative emotions. So in cases where attachment was strong, and we know attachment is always a factor in grief, typically negative and painful emotions are evoked. These are very common feelings in grief, and likely there's going to be no surprises to this slide, in that we typically experience sadness, protest. It's not okay that this person is gone. It's not okay that they died. This is not fair. Why me? Why them? Missing and yearning for the person we've lost, for our connection to them. It's like there's a hole in our hearts and we just feel that something isn't right in the world. Something is missing or lost and we want it back. We might search and look for our loved one and even imagine we see them or we hear them. As I was preparing this presentation and writing this slide, I actually thought of my own experience in this regard. My grandfather died about 30 years ago. And he and my grandmother, who I call Nanny, had been married for, my goodness, well over 40 years. And when my granddad used to come home, he would whistle to announce his arrival. And I probably should wet my whistle here, as he would say, so that I can replicate the sound he used to make, but it went something like this. So he made that sound when he came in. And my grandmother said to me, my nanny said, for a long time after he died, she would hear that sound announcing his arrival home, even though he was gone. And even when I talk about it, I can still remember it very well. I'm sure you have things that are coming to mind as I talk about this in terms of special things that your loved one did or said or made you feel when they were near you. Another negative emotion that we may experience is powerlessness. I can cry, I can get mad, I can rail at the heavens, but nothing I do can change what has happened. The fact that this loss has occurred. And sometimes this realization will lead us into a place of despair. And one of the things I hear as well, sort of along with despair in my therapy room, are expressions of guilt. I should have done more. I should have said, I'm sorry, or I love you, or I'll miss you, or you mean so much to me. And while I understand this, I always think, my goodness, why do we do this to ourselves when we're already in a place of such pain? Especially when typically everything we were doing was from a place of love or support. I think that in some way that guilt is an effort to reassert control, just some degree of power over a situation in which we feel helpless. And this is just speculation on my part, but perhaps something to think about. I've also heard that guilt is a worry about disappointing somebody else, or having disappointed somebody else, or having not done enough. But I think something that we need to remember is sometimes the person that we have a right not to disappoint is ourselves. And we don't always have the words or the ability or even the desire to be a certain way, given a certain set of circumstances, for example, stress. In my view, guilt shows that we have a conscience, but we don't always have to let it ride rough over us, especially when we're already in a place of pain, despair, or grief. This doesn't help. So in sum, the more significant the loss, the more profound the disruption in our lives and our ability to cope. Now I'd like to talk to you about symptoms of grief, because when we are in grief, we may not recognize what is happening to us because so many unknown or not understood and fundamentally scary symptoms can crop up. Some we may expect, like the negative emotions I just described, but others really may take us or those around us by surprise. And this is why I want to go through some common grief symptoms with you in the hopes of normalizing your experience somewhat if any of these things are happening to you or somebody that you know who is bereaved. Let's start with physical symptoms. So we've already talked about this first response of numbness. And this is that shock that happens, as I mentioned, which almost has an anesthetic quality. It numbs us. We're going through the motions of life, but we are not really feeling anything. And this can be both a blessing and a curse. When this happens to people, they often wonder what the heck is wrong with them. Why aren't I a mess right now? Well, this is basically your brain shutting things down so that you can cope. In some ways, this can be very helpful and give us the time we need to do the things we need so that we can create space for grief. Another thing that we see very commonly in grief is sleep disturbance. So, insomnia. It is so hard to be dealing with insomnia or sleep disturbance, multiple night wakings, early morning wakings when we are in grief, because sleep is often the one relief, sort of the last bastion of sanity that we have when we're in grief. And if we're not having nightmares, we crave it because we're so exhausted to begin with. So that not being able to sleep is sort of doubly problematic. I can tell you that when I was running a spousal grief group, when I was working for a local provider, one of the gentlemen that came to my group, he had been caregiving for his wife who had cancer for, my goodness, I think it was about 6 or 7 years. And he said to the group, because we all got quite comfortable with each other very quickly, he's like, I love coming here. He's like, because I cannot sleep. And he's like, after I come here, I'm able to talk or I'm able to listen and hear that you're dealing with similar things that I am. He's like, I sleep for 2 or 3 days afterward. So that was wonderful to hear that, just having an opportunity to speak about and sharing his experiences to mourn was allowing him, his body to relax sufficiently so that he could get some rest. Some people end up needing sleep medication. And, if you're in a position where you're not sleeping, this is something that you should talk about with your doctor. because you do need rest. But having said this, please know that sleep disturbance or reduced sleep is very common, and it should improve over time. Now, it can be quite a bit of time, but again, it should improve. Intense fatigue or fatigue also is something we see in grief. And again, this could be caused by lack of sleep or just general exhaustion, especially if you were a caregiver before the person that you love passed away. People are emotionally spent after a death, and a feeling of exhaustion is very common. We may also see the experience of headaches, again, tension headaches or migraines. This is a sign of stress, could also be due to lack of sleep. We may experience tightness in our throat or our chest, gastrointestinal distress, like just a sore stomach or a really upset stomach or digestive system. We may also be sighing, not wanting to eat. Sorry, that sort of goes with gastrointestinal distress as well. And, dizziness, sort of a loud heartbeat, like a racing heart, or just a sense of emptiness or heaviness. And that may include joint pain. We just ache, our heart aches. So finally, we also may see an increase in common illnesses. So we know, and research has taught us, that grief lives in the body. It really affects us at a cellular level. And this is why we need to be extremely gentle with ourselves when we're grieving as best as we can, because we may be more susceptible to illness. This is sometimes why people get really bad colds, which is a pretty loaded symptom right now during COVID, or infections, or sometimes more serious ailments after somebody has died. We may, and sort of very interestingly, see mirror symptoms or loved ones, or ourselves, and especially if we were a spouse, developing the same symptom that our loved one may have experienced before they died. So similar pains, worrying about contracting the same illness like cancer, and so on and so forth. So if you or someone you know is developing troubling symptoms during grief, it is of course important to get these checked out by your doctor, especially if they involve shortness of breath or heart palpitations, dizziness, especially in a pandemic. So in a nutshell, it's really wise to rule out a physiological problem before we attribute a symptom to an emotional response. But again, all of these things that I've talked to you about are normal in grief. Let's talk about some behavioral changes, because as I mentioned before, when we are in grief, we may behave in ways that seem foreign to us. Later, we'll talk about how to cope with some of these behavioral changes, because they can definitely be problematic and affect our relationships, including the relationship that we have with ourselves. We may just not recognize who we are when we're this distressed. The first item that I've mentioned here is avoidance. And we may avoid things because we are in a state of overwhelm. And I often say to my clients that avoidance is a valid coping strategy. The challenge is that it's not always a valid long-term coping strategy. But certainly what it is a sign that you have too much on your plate. So social withdrawal, for example, very common in grief. In as much as we may crave other people, we may also want to just have a break from them. Social withdrawal is a form of avoidance. We don't want to be around other people for a multitude of reasons. And it could be that we are just plain exhausted, or we don't want to talk, or we don't know what to say, or we don't feel like we can stop crying, or that we're completely numb. We're not there. It could also be that, if we're meeting with people that typically we spent time with our partner or our friend group or what have you, that it just hurts too much to be there. And this is particularly true of, traditions like a holiday or, a card game or something that we did with our loved one. People in grief often report too that they just feel forgetful or disorganized. They can't concentrate. The mind is not at its best when it's in grief because it is working overtime to integrate the loss. And this means that there's not always a lot of room for other things. In as much as we may be unable to concentrate or to focus, we may find ourselves hyperactive or really just sort of distracted. And again, I'll use a reference from my own experience here to illustrate. When my father died over 20 years ago now, I can remember writing 100 thank you notes in just a few days. And Patrick, who actually buried my father, I remember him commenting on it. So it's so strange that we sort of have that connection over such a lengthy period of time. You know, when I think back to myself at that time, I was just in just such a frenetic state, and I felt, oh my goodness, this is the most important thing. I need to get this done. But now, as I look back, it's really like, what was the big deal about this issue around etiquette during grief? But sometimes we just sort of hyper focus on something, or we get involved in doing something, and we just can't stop ourselves. And sort of in this vein, overwork is a form of hyperactivity. So, you know, having said that, working can also be a distraction or a coping mechanism. And so certainly we shouldn't feel badly if we decide to go back to work after we've had a loss. We are unique in our grief, and so it's whatever works for you, but it's just important to sort of recognize the difference here. Certainly, we may also experience changes in our sexuality, whether that be a complete loss of libido or we may feel hypersexual. Substance use can also be an issue, and we may find an increase or adoption of drinking, of using drugs, or overeating, because at the end of the day, food is a substance. Conversely, as I mentioned, again, we may find we have no appetite. You know, I was thinking that there's actually an Irish proverb that says that everything seems better after a good sleep, a good laugh, and a good drink. And so I don't want you to beat yourself up if you have the occasional glass of wine or two to relax at the end of a long day, or at, you know, the weekend, or even if you feel like you need to tie one on with friends, you know, in a way that we can do right now, if you're grieving. It's more when these behaviors of using substances to cope become chronic and that they're affecting you in negative ways that there could be a problem, and where you might want to be more vigilant about them or seek professional support. You may also find yourself Netflixing, and you know, this is basically watching hours and hours of mindless television or movies or, you know, shows that are on Netflix or other movie or entertainment providers. And I really do not see much of an issue with this. This really gives people a break from their reality. You know, if you can't sleep in the middle of the night and that soothes you or helps to relax you, then so be it. You know, also some of the storylines in these shows may really resonate with a person in a way that doesn't demand effort and may comfort them. In therapy, we sometimes recommend watching a particular movie or reading a particular book in a way that we think will comfort the person, because there's something there that they can identify with. So I would really recommend, you know, that if you feel the need to indulge here, that you do. And finally, we have the phenomenon of replacement to consider. And this is when essentially we reinvest too quickly. We see this very often in the loss of a pet. You know, maybe we have a beloved dog or cat that, you know, has been with us for many, many years, and that pet dies. And then I don't think this always happens, but sometimes we might go out and get another one because that pain is just so strong. But, you know, we haven't necessarily afforded ourselves the time that we need to process the grief, and also to create space in our hearts for that new pet. And certainly we see this in relationships as well. Now, there is really no prescribed time on reinvesting. That is very individual. So, we may know whether or not we feel ready, but something to consider, when something's moving quickly, am I replacing? Finally, we come to psychological symptoms. And really, this is when our mind is reeling. We may find ourselves completely preoccupied with the person that we've lost. We can't stop thinking about them. And there is a story that comes to mind here of a wonderful young woman that I know very well who recently lost her father. And she said to me, how can the world continue to go on without my dad in it? How can everyone not be affected by this? That's all I can think about. So again, this is your mind, her mind, doing its busy work to try and integrate the loss of this person, this loved person, into experience. Our minds, in essence, are obsessed. We may also sense the presence of our loved one. We may feel them, and this can be very comforting. And I anticipate for some it can be disconcerting. But many people find themselves looking for signs that their loved one is still there with them in some way, even if they've moved on, whatever your spiritual beliefs. So people talk about seeing signs, or, very meaningful coincidence. And I have a saying that coincidence is really God or the divine's way of remaining anonymous. Whether you see red cardinals, or you're finding coins, or your phone is ringing, unexpectedly at a very important time, 11:11 or 12:34, you might hear a special song come on just when you're thinking about that person that connects you to them. This is more of a phenomenon, as I see it, than a symptom, because a symptom sometimes has a negative connotation. And I think if these things bring you comfort, then embrace them. Talking about the possibility of an afterlife and our connection with a loved one after they've died is a really important consideration in grief, but unfortunately, somewhat beyond the scope of our discussion tonight, but worth mentioning. We may also have grief dreams. And there are lots of different types, but one of the most desired that people in grief and bereaved, or who are bereaved, talk about is a grief dream that's called a visitation. And this is when our loved one comes to be with us in our dream, whether they speak or they don't, or whether or not we simply may catch sight of them. And when we have this type of dream, more often than not, most report feeling greatly comforted. It can give a sense of peace, a sense of reunion or connection. And again, more often than not, very positive, but certainly there are times too when it can be quite disturbing. One of the hardest things that we may encounter in grief is feeling angry. And not only is this hard for us, it might be one of the harder things for people in our lives to deal with if we're finding ourselves anywhere from irritable to, feeling in a downright rage. We can also blow up at things that may seem inconsequential, like something breaking or not going right. And we just, we're just, we're in a rage all of a sudden. And, sometimes we're able to connect this to our grief, and sometimes we don't. We don't realize that this is, in fact, something that's causing us, that grief is driving our anger. We may also somaticize our grief. And, in addition to minimizing it. So minimizing it might mean, I'm okay. If the person was perhaps a coworker or maybe someone who's, not in our immediate family or immediate sphere, we might say, oh, it's not that big of a deal, or I'm okay, but wow. Then at some point later, we're like, oh, this was really important to me. And sometimes we even see this with public figures, like if somebody, really meaningful to us, who is a public figure dies, and wow, we really think, I didn't know them, but and it shouldn't be a big deal, but somehow it is. In terms of somaticizing our grief, this is really physical manifestations of grief. And psychological research shows that there certainly is a mind-body connection. And often we may manifest our distress physically, and this especially as if we may be suppressing some of our emotional responses. Feelings can be stuck in the body, and the body knows it, and somehow they come out. This is why sometimes you might see like unexplained rashes, or you might have very uncomfortable pains that after a full medical investigation yield nothing. Well, the pain is real, the rash is real, but it could be driven by grieving. Finally, we come into feelings of overwhelm. We just can't cope, it's too much. And this is when anxiety can ratchet up, as well as depressive feelings. And grief and depression really look a lot alike. And so this is really important to know. Typically, we don't medicate grief. Depression, as I said, is a component, but it's not a clinical depression necessarily that would require antidepressant medication. Having said this, if your depressive state is constant and it's crippling you and it's there for an extended period of time, then definitely you should talk to your doctor or therapist about pharmacology or talk therapy as a means of addressing being stuck in this sort of a depressive phase. The bottom line is we need to remember that grief is not pathological. It is not a disorder. It is natural, and we are wired to handle it. But it is incredibly painful, and for that reason, sometimes we may encounter suicidal thoughts. Generally, these are passive, and it's more about, I don't want to live in a world with this, without my loved one. I just don't want to be here. And this is not uncommon, especially when there are traumatic factors to grief. But it's very different to feel this way versus moving into an active phase of suicidal ideation. And this is really when we may have a plan to end our lives, or we're really, or we may have a history of suicide attempt. In that case, this is where intervention and professional help are really required in order to process these types of complex grief reactions. It's important to recognize that losses are connected, and that the present loss you're experiencing may trigger emotions that are connected to a former loss, especially if these losses have not been fully attended to or processed. In other words, they haven't been grieved. So we all have a history of attaching and losing, and sometimes losses from childhood will be revisited because there are still parts of us, young parts, that haven't fully processed these traumatic events. And I especially see this with parental loss. So no matter what age we are, young parts of ourself may come up that miss our mom and dad. And in effect, some aspects of our psyche, we're always children to our parents. And it can be really difficult to accept the permanency or even the event of their death. Not only because this means that we are not with them, we are orphaned in a sense, but what it means in terms of our own mortality. Parents are immortal. They're meant to be invincible, but unfortunately they're not. Past losses can also amplify our current loss. And I often think that trauma begets trauma. Every loss is different and needs to be grieved. But sometimes what happens is that loss happens in a way that is unrelenting or unexpected. Like we may have several losses over a short period of time. And sometimes when this type of thing happens, it can be, really overwhelming. And, we're just pummeled and we just cannot process. And so we're just sort of completely taken aback. And it's in these situations where it can be really helpful to talk to, either a therapist or, somebody that you really trust, whether that's a member of your clergy or a dear friend, just somebody who can offer you unwavering and unconditional support. There are in grief sometimes very complicating factors, especially if our loss is sudden or unexpected. If, like an accident or a diagnosis that results in a rapid decline in our loved one's health and perhaps ultimately leads to their passing. Correspondingly, if there has been extreme or prolonged suffering for our loved one, this can really be a complicated factor because we are suffering alongside them. And while this is happening, we may not always be in a position to talk to them about it or or even to talk to anyone about what we're dealing with. And this pain, this suppressed pain, can surface after the loss has occurred. If a death was traumatic, and by this I mean, for example, suicide loss or homicide, or more timely, COVID. If the loss occurs out of order, such as in the death of a child, this certainly creates the likelihood of a more complex or complicated grief reaction. Disenfranchised grief can be complicating. And what I mean by this is that the grief that we're experiencing is not necessarily socially supported, or other people don't have a social script, if you will, of what to say. And again, suicide is an example of, if we're bereaved by suicide, this is an example of where our grief can be disenfranchised or not understood. If our loved one died of a drug overdose, or from violence, or from a miscarriage, people just don't know what to say. And so they may minimize or trivialize these losses, or offer platitudes that really give us no comfort. Disenfranchised grief often also can lead to feelings of shame, like, I shouldn't be grieving like this. What's wrong with me? Or in cases of suicide, shame may surface in that the person may feel in some way responsible for the loss. We might also have had an ambivalent relationship to the loved one, as in the case of an abusive parent, child, or partner, sibling. Some parts of us may actually be relieved that that person is gone. We may finally feel safe, whilst we're simultaneously missing that person. Other parts of us may grieve the parent or the partner or the sibling we should have had and what could have been. Age as well can be a complicating factor in grief. Midlife, for example, is a time when we reflect on our whole life and can experience existential crisis, if you will. And I should know because I'm in it. What were the hopes and dreams of our life that have been lost, that we didn't achieve? And what do we want to look differently? And how can we now do that without our person beside us, the person that has died? As well as we move into elderhood, we may lose our friends, our spouse, our children, our faculties, our capacity to do things. And interestingly, research has shown that one of the best indicators of how we cope as we move into elderhood is how we cope with loss, because inevitably we're going to encounter it. And of course, the pandemic. This is a tremendous factor in grief as a complicating factor. And it complicates grief for a multitude of reasons. First of all, we're dealing with a collective trauma. And so anybody who has been encountering a loss since March 2020, you've likely encountered some of these complicating factors. First of all, we're already all dealing with, the horrific effects of this pandemic. So fear, constant stream of stories and loss, bad news, political unrest, and really the list goes on. We may also be dealing with difficulties related to system navigation, especially as it relates to healthcare and accessing resources. So, if we've been trying to navigate a system that's essentially shut down or has changed materially from what we know and understand, while also dealing with the stress of a loved one's declining health or our own health issues simultaneously, this could have meant problems with delayed diagnosis, could have meant hospitalization and related separation distress, frustrations, upsets, etc. And if our loved one died of COVID, there is definitely a greater likelihood of some complicating factors. And there's some really compelling research coming out of Australia right now that is showing that if our loved one indeed died of COVID-19, there is a greater likelihood that we would have experienced separation distress and complex grief reactions such as post-traumatic stress disorder. So definitely something that is an unfortunate byproduct of grieving in a pandemic. Finally, another thing we may experience is survivor guilt. So for example, if we both had COVID and my loved one passed away and I didn't, oh my goodness, what that brings up in us. And on a larger scale, there's so much suffering going on in the world right now This is really amping up overall distress. Social distancing and separation distress is really the opposite of what we need in grief. Remember, as I said earlier, that an important component of grieving is also, or of grief, is mourning. We need to express our grief socially in order to be able to heal. So during this pandemic, we may have been spending a lot of time in grief in that private process of grieving, but we've been denied the opportunity to mourn in traditional ways, to have a house full of people, to be hugged by a room full of people, or just have all those comforting sort of things said to us, casseroles given to us, the close presence of people bringing food and flowers and love to help sort of cocoon us when we're really in a time of need. You really think about it, funerals are for the living. These are ways and rituals to come together to respect and honor and share in collective pain over a loss. And this is the way we also remember and celebrate the person. And these rituals can bring us so much comfort. So I certainly know that Patrick and his team over the pandemic have come up with some really ingenious ways to meet the mourning needs of the families they serve, whether it be through virtual funerals, offering presentations and slideshows that can be viewed online, along with guest books or books of condolence, obituaries or commentary through social media. And I even know that Patrick told me about one wonderful story where a lovely woman had died away and she laid in wake in her home. And it was nice enough weather that people were able to come through the home in a distanced way without touching anything to pay their respects. So certainly there are creative ways to attend to our distress during this pandemic. So now as I move into the end of my presentation, I'd like to talk to you about how we cope when we're in the midst of all this chaos and, we need to move through it. Well, I think in this way, we really need to go back to understanding grief. And really, I want to tell you that significantly in grief, there are two sides of us that get triggered. There is the loss side, which I've already focused on because this gets most of our attention. And basically what we're talking about here is sadness and grief and mourning, all the distressing pieces of losing someone that we're attached to. Then there's the restoration side of us. And by contrast, this is a part of us that has to deal with the new complexities of life that arise from the loss. So restoration is what helps us to re-engage in life and look toward the future, because it is too stressful to spend all of our time in grief. There is a natural oscillation or moving back and forth between these two clusters. And my goodness, but this can lead us to feeling really conflicted internally. So on the one hand, if we've been caregiving for somebody who's been very ill for a long time, you might be saying to yourself, oh my goodness, I am so glad that they are not suffering anymore, that I don't have to witness that I don't have to get up in the middle of the night to care for them. I'm so exhausted. But then there's another part of you, your inner critic, if you will, that's like, how can I possibly be enjoying myself right now? I mean, I would be giving anything to care for that person again. So please know that this is a natural and normal way to respond. It is how we move through grief. And briefly, I will show you a diagram here of what that looks like. So on the left, we see sort of that loss orientation, and on the right, we see restoration. And this is called the dual processing model of grief, if any of you want to look into that after this presentation. Some other things to know is that until recently, grief has been seen as stage or phase-like. We were sort of to go through this very stepwise fashion of grieving, where first we were shocked, then we might have felt guilt and anger, we might have bargained, felt depressed, then we're supposed to feel better and accept what's happened and move on. And this implies that there's a timeline for grief. Well, what we need to know is that there is no timeline for grief. There just isn't. And while we may similarly experience some very common emotions or phases like anger or guilt, depression, even relief, each person experiences loss very differently. Even if we're in the same family, we are as unique in grief as thumbprints. And so we really develop individual coping strategies for grieving that can really cause some friction. Because if you imagine that you're the kind of person that likes to talk about your grief and process your feelings outwardly and, get support and all of that, and your partner, for example, in the loss of a child, just shuts down, well, there's a dissonance there, and you're not able to understand each other in that place, and it can really be disruptive. We also know that stages, if you will, of grief are not discrete and as disconnected as we may have originally thought. Not as connected as we may have originally thought. Like, we can sort of vacillate in and out of different emotions, even over the course of one day, or we can get stuck or mired in something for a lengthy period of time. So, when we first lose someone, it's not unusual that we might feel, shock and angry and devastated and relieved all at once. And so this sort of rapid cycling of emotion is very common, especially when we first lose someone. Conversely, when an anniversary of, the first anniversary of someone's death, or, an important occasion is approaching, we may feel ourselves feeling very low for an extended period of time. And this is not unusual either. So in terms of this, one of the things that I can tell you is that grief does not have an endpoint. And even though we're feeling better, we may experience what the acronym I've put here, which is a STUG. And this is a subsequent temporary upsurge in grief. And this is, for example, when a grief comes in a wave. We might be going along well, and all of a sudden, boom, we hear something, or we see something, or we smell something, and we're right back in that place of loss. And this can be really difficult to handle. So what are some coping strategies? What do I do? And I will be moving through this fairly quickly because we're coming to the end of the presentation and our time together. So I'll try and explain as fully as I can in the short period of time we have left. The first thing we can do is to name our feelings. And hopefully this presentation tonight will have helped you do that. We are entitled to our feelings. Feelings are feelings, and they're ours. We're allowed to feel them. And we actually need to feel the pain of grief in order to be able to process it. We can also validate what is happening to us with no judgment and a lot of self-compassion. We can avoid comparisons. My grief doesn't have to look like your grief. And I might grieve in a completely different way. I might mourn in a completely different way. This is fine. It's important to focus on your own needs, your own wants, and to develop coping strategies accordingly. So if you want to watch Netflix and lie in bed, stay up at night and sleep with your dog, and that's the way you cope with grief, then you go ahead and do that. You aren't hurting anyone. Routine as well can be very helpful to set boundaries at a time when life feels particularly chaotic. Routine doesn't have to be rigid, but it can offer a sense of control. Self-care as well. I actually find this an overused term, and it can be really hard to do if you've been caregiving or you've forgotten how. But I want to share with you the definition of self-care as I understand it, so that you can take it away, in that it is the practice of taking an active role in protecting your own well-being and your own happiness, particularly during a period of stress. It's that old adage that flight attendants give us when we get on the plane before it takes off. Got to put that oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on someone else in order to help them. And when we're in grief, we need lots of oxygen. Mourn, as I mentioned, share your grief with others. It's hard to do that right now, but by Zoom, by phone, by text, FaceTime, whatever works for you. Of course, expect the unexpected. You just never know what's going to come up in grief. And if you need it, seek professional support. Grief counseling, grief groups. There are lots of virtual options available right now, as well as in-person support. As well, to support other people in grief, I'll leave you with the thought that people who are bereaved typically report that they want repeated offers of assistance. I may not require grief now, but check in with me and don't tell me to call you if I need you, because I'm not going to do that, chances are. So show people patience, compassion, and love. I'm sure I haven't covered all possible coping strategies, and there are a ton of great books and resource information out there, but hopefully this has been helpful. So this brings my presentation to a close, and I want to say a sincere thank you to all of you for attending this seminar, and again to Patrick and Hulse Playfair McGarry for giving me the opportunity to present to you tonight. I hope you found the information helpful in terms of furthering your understanding of grief, whether it be your own or someone else's. And I wish you peace, and God bless you and your loved ones and the ones you've lost. I hope you have a peaceful evening, and now I will hand things back over to Patrick. Good night.
It was clear that you put a lot of thought and effort into the content, and I am certain that your suggested coping strategies, words, and advice will be helpful to all those that attended. Your professional and caring guidance regarding the complexities of COVID-19 are timely, and I also appreciated your including a grounding exercise for us. It is certainly without hesitation that I positively refer and endorse Suzanne Duke and her team for the professional services they provide. Thank you again, Suzanne. So as promised, within the next 24 hours, all attendees will be receiving a Hulse Playfair and McGarry Grief Resource Package by email. That package will have our complete Understanding Grief booklet, as well as an article written by Suzanne titled A Pandemic of Grief, that includes all of her contact information should you want to be in touch with Suzanne for personal assistance, or to follow her on social media, or sign up for her monthly newsletter. And I can certainly say, in addition to being a passionate and professional presenter, Suzanne is a wonderfully engaging writer. So I encourage you to sign up for that newsletter. So in that email that you will be receiving within the next 24 hours, there will also be a survey so that you can let us know your thoughts on this presentation. The survey also will provide you the opportunity to sign up for our newsletter, to provide input to us on future seminar topics. We do strive to provide helpful and useful information, so your suggestions are very important and very much appreciated to us, as well as any referral to speak. You can subscribe to our daily healing grief support email, or our weekly newsletter that provides insights, quotes, and messages on how you can help others who have experienced a loss during their first year. And once again, to let us know, if you haven't yet viewed our Being Prepared Made Simple presentation, we could share that recording with you and also provide you with a booklet called My Biography that will help you. So the survey is very important to us, and we would be very grateful to you for completing it. And I finally would like to remind you all that our website is a wonderful resource that is available to you at any time. It contains up-to-date information on how we are providing meaningful funeral services during this pandemic, what the current restrictions are, and how we are supporting the family and friends of those who have lost a loved one. It also provides support and guidance resources, information on our company and the services we provide, as well as the ability to pre-plan or arrange online. Of course, our knowledgeable staff is always available to provide answers or guidance by contacting us directly by email or phone, and hopefully one day soon by simply coming into one of our locations for an in-person chat. As I thank you for taking the time to attend, I also want to take the time to thank my colleagues at Hulse Playfair McGarry for all of their efforts in putting this virtual webinar together. We sincerely hope this presentation will be helpful to you. And please remember, if Hulse Playfair McGarry can be of service to you, we'd be honored. Thank you.